What Linnaean taxonomic rank is with amphibia? Subclass is monophyletic. Who says yes? Raise your hands. Who says no? Raise your hand. Subclass lists amphibia, not amphibia. Subclass lists amphibia. Is it monophyletic? Who says yes? Monophyletic. Okay, class amphibia is not monophyletic, but subclass list amphibia contains all extant groups of amphibians, and that is monophyletic. And one synapomorphy for that group is what? Kind of hard to point because I have a mask on. Teeth, if it were kind of tooth. Two part, pedicellate tooth, you ought to be able to sketch that, explain that, right? And within subclass this amphibia, there are 3 orders. What is one? One order. Anura. Next row.
Urodela.
Next.
Gymnasiana.
Okay. Which 2 of those orders together make up a monophyletic group? Okay, the ones with the URs in them, right? Urodela and Anura. Okay? You gotta remember some of these groups in order to make various comparisons that are of interest. And today we're going to focus on reproduction in amphibians. And a good way to organize this material is to compare and contrast these different groups of amphibians with respect to courtship, how fertilization occurs, the sort of sexual dimorphism there is, and sort of how widespread it may be, as well as the presence or absence or the extensiveness of parental care in these groups. Okay? So we'll go through some examples, but again, the key thing you want to be able to do is come back up after we have those specifics and paint a bigger picture for how things map onto the evolutionary relationships of these different groups. And once again, it's not just fishes that have all the fun with respect to reproduction and doing things different ways. There's a lot of diversity within amphibians. And I think some of what we'll cover will be rather surprising to you, I hope. Okay. So first, let's consider the caecilians, also known as order Gymnopiona. Now remember that these are very specialized burrowing animals. They're a tropical group of animals. So when you have animals that are beneath the ground in rainforest sorts of situations, it shouldn't be too surprising. We don't know as much about them as a lot of the more conspicuous groups of amphibians. So it's not like you can readily go out and stumble across a couple of caecilians courting. Okay? We do know something about how fertilization occurs, and rather surprisingly, it occurs via a copulatory organ that's present in the male. Okay, and here's an old anatomical drawing showing that the rear end of a caecilian and emerging from the cloaca is the copulatory organ. Now you wouldn't see this unless the caecilians were actually mating. So unlike the copulatory organ of mammals that you can often see externally, this remains internal except when the males are copulating with the females. Now, what is a reproductive mode, or what are reproductive modes that are allowed if you have internal fertilization?
Ovoviviparous.
Okay, and what's another one? Viviparous, okay? So you can have development proceed inside the female if in fact fertilization occurs inside the female. Another fun fact about Sicilians is that the lion's share of them, about 3/4 of them as far as known, are actually viviparous. Now remember, we're using a very generic definition of vivipary, where some of the dry biomass of the young at birth is above and beyond the dry biomass that would be possible just from the yolk of the egg that gives rise to the developing offspring. And remarkably enough, some Sicilians actually attain this nutrition by grazing, if you will, on the uterine lining of the female. So obviously, if they do this, they have to have rather well-developed jaws to do so, even though they're still living within the body of the female. Okay? And some even more remarkable behaviors exist, some of which have been discovered fairly recently.
One great group of flowering amphibians has lost its eggs altogether.
Remarkably convergent in appearance to what group of reptile?
You might think that this is
Well,
but if you pick it up,
I can think
you
of
will
even
immediately
better.
realize it's got a strong, firm
Anthocenians.
its persistence. Sicilians are found in almost all rainforests, but they are seldom seen if they spend nearly all their lives underground. The female, having produced her young, stays in her nest chamber for the day. Sicilian eyes are rudimentary.
Someone's talking about cute frogs. I don't know. You think babies
In
can
the
see
darkness
them?
of the tunnel, however, the animals have no need. The young enthusiastically lick a secretion from the gland at the end of their mother's tail, and their constant hunger seems to be the factor that keeps this little blind family together.
So there's one source of parental care, providing that secretion for nutrition.
Incredibly, increase their weight by 10 times, apparently just from drinking that secretion. But could that be their only food? As we thought, one of the youngsters revealed a clue to their rapid growth. It dawned. It already had hooked teeth like a baby shark. It surely doesn't need these if it's going to do nothing but drinking. Could it be feeding on something else?
They do not cannibalize each other, unlike that shark.
Cameras, for the first time, revealed the answer. There was a sudden frenzy of activity. The babies started swarming all over their line. They were tearing at her flanks, ripping off segments of her skin, skin that proved to be full of fat. It turned out that she re-grew her skin every 3 days to provide her young with another nourishing food.
So yet another source of parental care, and perhaps one of the most unusual sources of nutrition among all vertebrates for their offspring. Okay? So some really weird stuff in Sicilians. And again, given how poorly known the group is, who knows what else is going on that remains to be discovered. Okay? Of course, Eurovila is the salamanders and newts. And again, painting with rather broad brush strokes, I think one could say that in this group, tactile cues and chemical cues are the most important types of cues during courtship. Unfortunately, the video file links in this PowerPoint slide aren't working, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to view the videos of Plethodonta shermani on the Canvas website, where you can actually see courtship as well as fertilization occurring. And during courtship, commonly you'll see the male transiently on top of the female. And a lot of times there's all this sort of intimate body contact and rubbing and so on, and also involving the chin. And one of the reasons for that is think back to all these various glands that can be found in the skin of amphibians that have diverse secretions. There's one in the chin region, the mental gland, or also known as the hedonic gland, that releases a pheromone that can be absorbed through the skin of the female, and that makes the female receptive to the male for mating. Now again, I'm sort of painting with broad brush strokes. There are a number of newts that do use visual displays, and as a result, some of those males differ conspicuously in their anatomy relative to the females. They have some rather elaborate crests and brighter colors than the females. But that's a rather small number of species compared to this more generic sort of courtship that goes on that involves this hedonic gland under the chin of male Plethodontic salamanders. Here are the cloacas of two salamanders. Arguably, they look different. One is a male and one is a female. Who says the one on the left is a female? Raise your hands. Who says it's a male? Raise your hands. Okay. Well, as it turns out, that is a male. And here we have yet another gland that's very important, that's well developed in the males, effectively absent in the females. And that's because this cloaca gland of the male salamanders that have such a gland makes a spermatophore. So a spermatophore is sort of a gelatinous substance within which the sperm are embedded. And this actually provides a mechanism of having internal fertilization, even though the males lack a copulatory organ. So another one of those videos that unfortunately got messed up on here shows you a plethodontic female actually walking over a spermatophore, which just sort of looks like a little pile of stuff. And after getting carefully aligned with the male, she stops when her cloaca is just over the spermatophore. And remarkably, then the cloaca opens up and scoops up the spermatophore, and then fertilization occurs. So I think it's really fascinating that here you've got a mechanism of internal fertilization in the absence of a copulatory organ. okay? If we think about salamanders a little bit more and how much they invest, most salamanders do have parental care of the eggs, but there's a little bit of a cautionary note here. Hopefully by now you're well aware that the vast majority of living species of salamanders belong to one family, the plethodontid salamander. So one of the reasons why parental care is so widespread is that it's widespread in this family with perhaps a minimum number of evolutionary origins, rather than being widespread as a result of popping up independently in many, many different places, okay? And here's a redback salamander guarding the eggs. These are sort of little guys. I think you've seen these in lab, Plethodon cinereus. They'd be maybe about 1/4 of an inch in diameter. The other thing I'd like you to note is how large those eggs are relative to the adult salamander. And then necessarily, too, how few of them are. So you see a lot of life history trade-offs, yet again, between the amount of parental investment and the size of the egg, which of course gives rise to different size of the offspring. You sort of pay up front, or do you pay later? They're very different strategies, okay? You have the reproductive modes of salamanders and the neurons on your handout 11. All this stuff is on your handout 11. And they're very, you could split this up to varying levels of detail, so realize this doesn't cover absolutely every single thing that happens, but hopefully this gives you a good overview. And the first major split that you can see, accounting for how reproduction occurs, is whether or not internal fertilization occurs. So, noteworthy families that have external fertilization and aquatic larvae include Cryptobranchidae, the sirens, and Hynoviidae. Okay? Now, if you look at your handouts and see where those are in the salamander phylogeny, what do you think the implications of that are for the likely ancestral method of reproduction for salamanders? So what do you think is the likely ancestral method of reproducing in salamanders? External fertilization and with aquatic larvae, okay? So we've got a whole bunch of salamanders. There's a lot more diversity here, where we include the plethodontids for internal fertilization, and remember that that's happening via a spermatophore rather than via a copulatory organ. So that includes the anthestomatids, the salamandrids, and a bunch of the plethodontids. But then, even if there's the same pattern for fertilization, you have some very important differences for the eggs, where the eggs are located, how the young develop, and actually where the young feed, or how aquatic or how terrestrial they are. And then in some extremes, you actually see, rather than a larval amphibian, sort of a miniature adult, if you will, without gills, sort of little dude, ready to go. So in some relatively rare cases within salamanders, you see direct development, and you don't have this profound change that occurs from a larval form that is largely aquatic to an adult form. Yet another amazing thing that has evolved within salamanders, in certain montane populations of salamandrids, which includes newts and things like the fire salamander, the eggs are retained in the oviduct. And development proceeds. Okay. So this is a fire salamander in the genus Salamandra. They're found in Europe, and some of them get into rather high elevations. Obviously, at higher elevations, it's colder than at lower elevations. And in this remarkable footage, there's a baby salamander being born. Now notice, it's still aquatic, and it still has external gills, but nonetheless, it's developed inside mom and is born blind. So that would be an example of ovoviviparity. Okay? Because the dry mass of those babies can be explained by the dry biomass of the egg. I guess that last shot was of a contented mom after having the babies. Okay? Well, far and away, the most diverse order of extant amphibians are the anurans. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. And some of that stuff actually represents a significant departure from what you find presumably in the ancestral vertebrate tetrapod. Okay? First, let's start with the two sexes getting together, namely courtship. Unlike other groups of extant amphibians, nearly all, I emphasize nearly all, not every single species, have males that vocalize, and those vocalizations are used to attract the females. So if you don't know anything else about a frog or a toad, it's a pretty safe bet that the males are going to employ this strategy for attracting females. In those groups that lack male vocalization, rather than retaining an ancestral, primitive condition, this appears to be a secondary loss of these anatomical structures and the ability to produce sounds that attract the females. This has evolved independently more than once, and one factor in common is species that are found near mountain streams. Of course, if you've been near a mountain stream, you hear all this noise from the rushing water, so you actually have a great deal of background noise. That represents a significant problem if you're trying to use auditory cues for courtship. Okay? Now, what is some of the information conveyed by these sounds that are produced? Just as you're probably aware, for different species of birds, ornithologists can often identify species of birds based on their sounds alone. So too, in the Nuren amphibians, you have sounds that are unique to a particular species of amphibian within a given geographic area. Okay? That's important to emphasize. So you could probably find some United States species of frog and go to neotropical America and find another frog that has a similar call. But invariably, for all the assemblages of the Nurens breeding in a given area, it's really quite easy to recognize the different species. Okay? So a very important function of that is if you convey species identity, then hopefully you don't have an oopsie and breed with the wrong species, okay? So that's an example of a pre-mating isolating mechanism among different species. Now, I'm kind of emphasizing the use of calls in courtship, and when that's done, that's referred to as an advertisement call. But there are some other vocalizations that occur. But these advertisement calls, the ones that are used to attract females, are the ones that are conspicuously different among different species of neurons. Okay. So this little sound clip has, oh dear, some of those different calls.
Number one, bullfrog, rabbit takes me on a.
Tell why it's called a bullfrog. Not because it looks like a bull, but it rather sounds like a bull. And it starts off with one individual, and then you can hear some other individuals chiming in.
Northern leopard frog, rabbit takes me on.
Now, rana is the old name for the genus, probably aware it can either be called rana or with the babies, depending on the species. So it's that sort of croaky sound, that chuckling sound. It's the leopard
Number
frog.
23, straightened keeper, Sumatrus crucifix.
Now, this is in a different family. So remember, these guys are an example of hylids, the tree frogs. They're little dudes. They're only about an inch long. And hear how high-pitched that call is. There's a rough correlation between size, I should say an inverse correlation between frog size and frequency. Bigger frogs have deeper voices.
Island Chrysosceles.
So this is the gray tree frog. And hear those quite often here, often even when it's not breeding season. And they're a bit larger than the spring peepers. Maybe they're about an inch and a half long or so.
7, western chorus frog.
This is another hylid frog. They're tiny.
Number 31, northern cricket frog, a Earthrepetan.
This is another hylid frog, another very tiny one. And one of the challenges when you go to new locations is some of these little frogs, as the name implies, sound quite insect-like rather than more musical. So it can really be tough telling certain types of katydids from frogs and so on when you go to a new area.
American toad, Bulo americanus.
These and spring keepers are two of the earliest breeders in our area. And a lot of times you'll hear American toads sort of in the floodplains near rivers and creeks. It's a very long, trilled call. This one breeds a bit later. And one thing that's interesting is those two species of toads, the American toad and Fowler's toad, look quite similar. They're pretty similar size, but they have these radically different calls. And on top of that, they breed at different times of year. And they're very closely related to each other. Okay? So that is just some sampling of the different calls. And I think you can clearly see how it's easy to pick out, to differentiate one species from another. There are some other circumstances in which sounds are made. One of these is referred to as a male release vibration. So this is a male frog. And realize that when a neurons mate, the male commonly hops on the back of the female and grasps the sides of the female. Well, here you can see, to get this footage, an individual is doing that with their fingers. So the clear purpose of that is, hey, get off my back, bub. I'm a male, not a female. Don't waste your gametes on me. So that's a way of conveying yet another important aspect of identity, namely the sex of the individual. So again, think of these sounds as signals that are transmitting certain types of information, okay? And yet another type of information that can be transmitted is get the heck out of my space. And it depends on the species for how different these territorial calls are from advertisement calls. For those little spring peepers, instead of that single peep, when they get into territorial disputes, they have a high-pitched little trill, sort of a, I can't quite do it high enough, but quite different than that single note call that's used for advertisement. So, all is copacetic. We've got all this information being conveyed about identity. Another thing, of course, is location, because if you're producing sound, then the female can come to where you are instead of you going to where the female is. Do you think there are any downsides to doing this? Yes. Yes. So if you're making yourself conspicuous and saying, hey, here I am, that's great if a mate happens upon you. But if you have an unintended receiver of that signal, things can play out very, very badly. So there are actually some species of predators that will locate the frogs because of their vocalized. And a classically studied system is a tropical frog known as the Tungera frog.
My name is Rachel Page. I'm a staff scientist at Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute, and I study predator-prey interactions. And one of the cool things that I study, I look at this bat that feeds on frogs. It's known as the fringelet bat, or the frog-eating bat. It uses the advertisement calls that frogs make to attract their mates to find frogs. So in order to get a mate, this frog has to produce a loud, conspicuous advertisement call. But by doing so, it's then putting itself vulnerable to.
Now that's the Tungera frog, that last one.
And this is a neat situation because it's a conundrum that many animals face in nature. It's this tug between natural selection on the one hand and sexual selection on the other hand. What we do is go out into the rainforest at night. We set up mist nets near streams and small ponds, and we net until we catch the species we're interested in, the frog-eating bat. Once we catch this bat, we bring it back to a large outdoor flight cage in the forest edge, and we run a whole bunch of behavioral tests. Most of them involve speakers. We broadcast frog call from the speaker. We look at how the bat responds. We videotape responses with infrared video cameras. One of the most interesting things that we've discovered is that bats are actually very flexible and very quick learners. Just by listening to the frog mating call, they can tell if it's a palatable species of frog or a poisonous species of frog.
Obviously, using that species identity for a different reason.
Give them new information. They also can learn very quickly.
And a lot of frogs are very toxic.
They can quickly change the associations they have. So there's a number of reasons why this kind of work is important. For one, it's just fascinating to know what the animals do in the natural world around us. But another is in terms of conservation, we can't preserve the natural history that surrounds us without knowing more about it. I was always interested in animals and in the natural world growing up. It's one of those kids who had tons and tons of bizarre pets. I think the most exciting moment was actually the first time I saw these bats in the tropics, and I was catching these frog-eating bats for the first time. I brought them to the vet cage, played with the frog call, and it was incredible to watch because you saw these amazing ear motions that tracked the frog call. And then you saw the bat fly right to the speaker and look for the frog that it assumed was inside the speaker.
So sound alone was
moment.
enough to
Yeah,
elicit
incredible animals and
searching and predatory behavior.
can I ask?
But there's been a whole bunch of additional things that have been done that have actually shown that the sonar of the bats is also very useful for locating the frogs and so on. So sort of an upside, kind of a downside. And for that Tungera frog, it has an unusually complex call, where it has one part that's referred to as a whine, sort of, and then a sound, sort of a whine and a chuck, multiple notes. As it turns out, those different parts of the call enhance or diminish the ease of being able to locate where the sound is in space. The more notes that are added onto the call, the easier time females have locating a male. And a fascinating thing about this particular system is that when the frogs detect the bats, they actually change the complexity of their call to make it more hard for them to be located. So of course that makes it harder for the bats, but the downside is that also makes it harder for the females to locate. So as you mentioned, a fascinating yin and yang between natural selection and sexual selection. Okay? Well, in endurance, sexual dimorphism is pretty darn common. Which one of these do you think is the male? On top or on bottom? On top, okay, little teeny male. Again, we have a bit of a recurrent theme, absent some other things going on. Bigger females can have more eggs. Obviously, the size of the male effectively has nothing to do with the amount of gametes that the male can produce. And in some cases, the sexual size dimorphism, as shown here, is pretty doggone extreme. Obviously, males vocalize. It depends on the species for whether or not females also have the ability to vocalize. There are a lot of species where it's just the male. And then realize it's not just a matter of having that sound producing apparatus, but you have to have all of the neural circuitry that's involved in controlling sound production. So a lot of differences associated with sound production. And as is shown here, there can be differences in size, and painting with broad brush strokes, if you lack additional information, it's pretty safe to assume that females are going to be larger. But, and we saw a bit of this with some species of fishes, when there's some combat involved, such as males fighting with each other for access with females, or males that are actually territorial towards other males. In some of those cases, as is the case with the North American bullfrog, the males may actually be larger than the females. Okay? And remember I mentioned that, as is shown here, the males generally grasp the female with the forelimbs. And interestingly, in some species, such as this, these two specimens of Leptodactylus pentadactylus, notice how big and muscular the forelimbs are of the male compared to the female. Now, their overall size is really quite similar. So look at that big old chunky arm, and not just the muscles, but look at how much larger the humerus is. Of course, if you have bigger muscles, you often use bigger surface areas onto which those muscles attach. So there can be some pretty profound differences in anatomy, either internal or actually external. We briefly mentioned that the extent to which skin of amphibians is keratinized can vary quite a lot. And this is especially the case in many anurans belonging to the family Bufonidae, both in the New World and in the Old World. And very often, the sex that has more heavily keratinized skin and is sort of rougher, bumpier, are the males. Now, this may occur over the entire body, but a very common thing is the occurrence of a nuptial pad. And that becomes pronounced during the mating season. And in some cases, not only is there a little keratinized patch on the skin, there may actually be a spine-like structure. So here are some male anurans, and you can see all of this dark stuff. So this is keratin. This is very rough, sort of, notice all these little spikes on here to help the males grip the females. And look at these nasty spines on this leptodactylus. Okay, I remember when my advisor was working with his wife in the neotropics, and they collected some Leptodactylus pentadactylus. The doggone male actually jabbed these things into the hand of one of these biologists and drew blood. So these are pretty formidable structures, although they're superficial structures. Okay? And I just couldn't resist throwing this in. Why on earth you have these keratinized spines surrounding the upper portions of the mouth? I don't know, but I guess, if you're a party animal and you're a frog, that's very good looking. Okay? Now, I mentioned those spines that were just sort of these conical chunks of keratin. Remarkably, in the gladiator frogs, there's actually a spine that is made out of bone. As the name implies, with gladiator frogs, they're highly territorial. They scoop out a crater of mud and make a nest in there. The males defend that. And in some of their territorial disputes, they literally slash each other with these spines. And sometimes those injuries can actually be fatal. So don't think of anuran amphibians as just being these little benign things always. There's some amazing stuff that happens. And then again, just sort of for your amusement, but to also emphasize some of the tremendous diversity you can find in anuran amphibians. In some very rare cases, in some Southeast Asian rotted species, males can actually have enlarged teeth. And again, why that should occur is not so obvious. When you think of structures that sort of enhance grip on the female, I think that sort of makes sense. Yes?
In that diagram, is it just the tissue that's making the teeth longer?
No, that's a tooth. That's a real tooth. So that's not just a bump in the skin. You can sort of see that the skin goes up to about there, but then that's the tip of a regular tooth. Yeah, I only want one of those chomping on you. Okay? So again, painting with broad brush strokes in anuran amphibians, fertilization is external. But there's always got to be an exception to a rule, and that exception to the rule are the tailed frogs belonging to the Scaphidae. The taxonomy on the tailed frogs has gone back and forth. There's some in North America, there's some in New Zealand. Sometimes they're all put in one family, sometimes they're put into two families. But there are very, very few of these things. And they're noteworthy for having, it's not really a proper tail with vertebra. It's almost an extension of the cloaca, but the function of that is to allow for internal fertilization. And for both these New Zealand and North American species of tailed frogs, they live in very fast-flowing streams. So think about the problems that poses for males and females releasing gametes, potentially the sperm of the male could get washed downstream before they have a chance to fertilize the eggs of the female. Well, the frogs have to be in close proximity in order for the gametes to get together. And as I've mentioned, generally the males use the forelimbs to grasp the female, but the female may be grasped in different regions. In some cases, the male grasps the female in the pelvic region, and that's referred to as inguinal amplexus. And here you see some pipids, and then here you see some midwife toads, and if you look at where those are on your phylogeny, the reasonable inference, the most parsimonious explanation of this is this would actually be the primitive condition for amplexus, whereas grasping the female in around the pectoral region is derived. So interestingly, that's actually a synapomorphy for a good chunk of the neuron diversity that's illustrated on your handout 8 that has the phylogeny. And here's just some examples for some hylo frogs and for some toads, for some buphonids. So again, I'm painting with all these broad brush strokes, but then there are variations on these themes that are kind of interesting to ponder, again, emphasizing the diversity in these. The male is the gray individual, and rather than grasping behind the forelimbs, the male tenderly grasps the female beneath the chin. Isn't that cute? Here the male kind of sits on the female's head, a little strange, a little bit kinky, I guess. And then my favorite, the little chubby breviceps, okay? You got a bit of a mechanical problem here for two little chubbies, right? Little stubby legs. How is the male doing this? Specialized gland, a glue gland, sticks to the female instead of holding the female, okay? And finally, you get old and tired of each other. It's like, okay, well, let's just get this done. We don't want to look at each other, all right? So lots of diversity for neuron amphibians is the underlying punchline of all of this, okay? And when it comes to parental care, we also see a great deal of diversity. But again, painting with broad brush strokes, there are an awful lot of the neurons that don't have any parental care. But when you have a large number of species, even if you have 10% of all the species having parental care, the absolute number of species that have parental care is indeed noteworthy. And this can occur in a variety of forms. Different sorts of nests can be built. Commonly, the nest may be defended. And one type of nest is to actually whip up a foamy trough into which the eggs are deposited. Here's that crater made by that gladiator frog that I mentioned. You can see the eggs in the middle of that puddle that's inside of that crater-like structure. And then in some cases, the eggs are actually carried on the back. This is a midwife toad, a discoglossid toad. And then this is a Suriname toad. It's a very strange way of reproducing. Okay. I love this. Okay. They got a close-up view of the back of the female. The eggs are deposited on the back of the female, and then the skin of the female swells up around and surrounds those eggs, and then the eggs develop in those craters, and then you see itty bitty frogs emerging out of those craters. Could anything get weirder than that? I don't know. Perhaps. Okay. In some cases, eggs are guarded. In some cases, the frogs actually actively shuttle water and keep the eggs well hydrated. And here are some examples of the central-leaved frogs whose eggs are deposited on the undersides of leaves above streams. And interestingly, the males of this species have spots that have an uncanny resemblance to the eggs. One of the big problems they have is there's a predatory wasp that attacks the eggs. So even though these are little dudes, they actually defend the eggs against those wasps, and that coloration appears to help that process. In some cases, the tadpoles may actually be carried from one location to another. This is most common in the so-called poison arrow frogs. And in a very rare case, you may even see the young developing not in the reproductive tract, but rather in some very strange locations, such as the mouth or the stomach. So actually, this didn't develop in the mouth, it's emerging from the mouth. Sadly, this Australian species of frog that is a stomach brooder is thought to be extinct now. But just think of what a remarkable evolutionary specialization that is, to have to shut down the digestive system so you don't digest your developing young. Okay? We'll have just a couple more odds and ends having to do with parental care, and then we'll be moving on to reptiles next class. Again, make sure I got your take-home assignment. Okay? I just want a hard time.